Everyone's heard of the Eastern Front, but almost no one actually understands what it felt like to fight on it. Not from a map, not from a history book, from inside a steel box that cooked you in summer, froze you in winter, and drew enemy fire every single hour of every single day. And yet, inside those tanks, German Panzer crews developed something strange. A ritual. A habit so specific, so deliberate, that it survived even when the orders didn't. After every engagement, no matter the outcome, no matter the losses, no matter how exhausted the crew was, they would stop before moving into their rest position and rotate one track to face east. Not west, not toward home, east, toward the enemy, toward the direction from which the next blow would come. If you've never heard this before, that's not an accident. It didn't get written into official doctrine. It didn't show up in training manuals. It spread the way superstitions spread in combat, quietly, person to person, tank crew to tank crew, through whispers and demonstrations and the weight of survival. And the men who did it weren't being irrational. They were being honest about something the German High Command refused to admit for years. Something about the Eastern Front that changed everything about how war was fought, survived, and remembered. If this kind of deep dive into the real psychology and mechanics of armored warfare is what you're looking for, stay here. Hit that subscribe button right now, because we go places the surface-level documentaries never reach. Let's start with the tank itself, because to understand why a crew would develop this kind of ritual, you first have to understand what life inside a German Panzer actually was. And the answer is one of the most brutal and underappreciated realities of the Second World War. A Panzer III in 1941 was about 6 meters long, just over 2 meters wide, and weighed somewhere around 20 tons. The crew of 5 men, a commander, a gunner, a loader, a driver, and a radio operator were packed into a space that would feel claustrophobic to anyone who's never had to share it, with ammunition racks, a breech mechanism, hydraulic lines, electrical cables, and the constant ambient heat of a running engine radiating through the hull. The interior temperature during summer operations on the Eastern Front could exceed 50 degrees Celsius. In winter, before the engine warmed up, the metal inside was cold enough to pull the skin off your bare hand if you touched it without thinking. The noise was relentless. When the engine was running, communication between crew members required either a headset intercom or screaming directly into someone's ear. The vibration was constant, a deep mechanical shudder that traveled up through the seat, through your spine, and settled into your teeth after long enough. Outside sounds, the crack of incoming fire, the whump of artillery landing close, the rattle of small arms against the glacis plate, all of it came through as a distorted version of what it actually was, muffled in some frequencies, amplified in others. You heard a tank round strike nearby, not as an explosion, but as a violent slap of pressure, followed by ringing, followed by silence, and then your own breathing. And then there was the visibility problem. From inside a closed-down tank, the world visible to any individual crew member was dramatically limited. The driver in a Panzer III had a small visor and 2 periscopes. The gunner had his optic. The commander had a cupola with vision blocks, which in early models were simple armored glass ports that could be cracked or obscured by dust, mud, rain, or battle damage. If the hatches were closed, which they often had to be in combat, the crew's combined field of view was a narrow, fragmented picture of what was happening around them. Enemy infantry could get within 10 meters of the tank from certain angles without being visible to anyone inside. This is the environment that produced the ritual. Not comfort, not calm, not the deliberate, reasoned reflection of men sitting in a lecture hall looking back at their experiences. These were men who made decisions under conditions that civilian psychology has almost no framework for. And the decisions they made, including the ones that looked like superstition from the outside, were rooted in very specific lessons about what kept you alive on the Eastern Front versus what got you killed. Now let's talk about what the Eastern Front actually was, because even people who know the history often don't understand the scale of it in a way that lands viscerally. Operation Barbarossa, launched on the 22nd of June 1941, was the largest military invasion in human history. Germany, along with its Axis partners, launched approximately 3 million soldiers across a front that stretched roughly 3,000 kilometers from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. The armored component of that force, the Panzer divisions, was considered the decisive element. These were the units that had torn through Poland in 3 weeks and France in 6. The doctrine was proven. The The machines were the best in the world. The plan was to reach Moscow before winter. That was not what happened. What happened instead was something that fundamentally changed the nature of modern warfare, and, in doing so, fundamentally changed the men who fought it. The Soviet Union did not collapse. It bent, absorbed, bled, retreated, and then it pushed back. The distances involved were unlike anything the German military had trained for. The supply lines stretched beyond breaking. The roads, which were often not roads at all but unpaved tracks that became rivers of mud in autumn and frozen ruts in winter, destroyed vehicles faster than combat did. And the enemy, despite catastrophic losses in the early months, kept producing more tanks, more men, more artillery, and more of the one thing the German high command had completely failed to account for: will. For the Panzer crews specifically, the Eastern Front represented a kind of continuous, escalating pressure that the Western campaigns had never produced. In France, an armored engagement might last hours. On the Eastern Front, an armored engagement could last days. The front was never truly quiet. There was no sector where you could reasonably assume you would not be attacked. The Soviets had learned, painfully and at enormous cost, that German armored tactics depended on speed, concentration, and the disruption of enemy command and control. And they had found ways to counter it. By 1942, a German Panzer crew facing Soviet armor was no longer facing the disorganized, poorly coordinated formations of 1941. They were facing an enemy that had absorbed German doctrine, adapted it, and developed its own solutions. The T-34, which had existed in 1941 but had been used poorly, was now being deployed in numbers that staggered imagination. Soviet artillery coordination had improved to the point where a German tank that sat still for too long in a recognizable position could expect to receive accurate indirect fire within minutes. And Soviet infantry anti-tank tactics, using close assault methods with Molotov cocktails, bundled grenades, and later dedicated anti-tank weapons, meant that a tank separated from its infantry support was vulnerable in ways that armored vehicles were never supposed to be. This is the world inside which the ritual developed, and to understand why it took the specific form it did, you need to understand what happened to tanks that were surprised from the east, from the direction of the enemy. In armored warfare, the direction from which an attack comes is everything. The armor on a tank is not uniform. The glacis plate, the front slope, is almost always the thickest. It is angled to deflect rounds, to increase the effective thickness of the steel, and to give the crew the best possible chance of surviving a direct hit. The sides of a tank are thinner. The rear, where the engine lives, is the thinnest and most vulnerable of all. A round penetrating the rear of a tank often ignites the engine, which in turn ignites the fuel, which in turn ignites the ammunition, and the crew has seconds, if they are lucky, to get out before the vehicle becomes a crematorium. German Panzer crews knew this. They had trained for it, and after months and years of fighting on the Eastern Front, they knew something else, something that the training didn't cover and the doctrine didn't address. When a tank was parked in a defensive rest position overnight, it was not safe. Not in the East, because the East was a direction from which attacks could come, not just in daylight, not just from visible enemy formations, but at night, in the dark, from infiltrating infantry, from fast-moving armored probes, from artillery that had registered your position during the day and waited for nightfall. And if an attack came while you were at rest, if it came while the crew was sleeping in or near the tank, if it came before you had time to fully orient, the direction your tank was pointed when that attack arrived could be the difference between the crew surviving and the crew dying in their vehicle. So they rotated the track, one track forward toward the east, not both, because that would require the engine running, which drew attention and used precious fuel. Just one. The adjustment was small, symbolic in physical terms. But what it represented was an attitude, a constant acknowledgement that in the East there was no true rest. There was no moment when you could afford to treat your vehicle as anything other than a weapon that needed to be oriented toward the threat. Now, some historians who have looked at this question will point out that rotating a single track on a parked tank does not actually change the direction the vehicle is pointing by any meaningful degree unless the driver engages the transmission and performs a proper pivot, and they are correct. In purely mechanical terms, the gesture was limited in its practical utility, but this misses the point entirely, and it misses it in the same way that dismissing a soldier's pre-combat ritual as irrational misses the point. The ritual was not primarily about the mechanical effect, it was about the mental one. What the track rotation did was force every crew member to perform a conscious act before rest, to stop, to think about the east, to orient themselves psychologically toward the direction of danger before they allowed themselves to sleep or eat or relax. It was a formalized version of vigilance. It was a way of saying, out loud without words, that this crew has not forgotten where they are. Combat veterans across all branches of military service and across all historical periods have developed rituals that function in exactly this way. They are not irrational. They are responses to environments where the cost of inattention is immediate and catastrophic. The ritual externalizes the internal mental state required to survive in that environment. It makes the invisible discipline of constant awareness into a visible, shared act that reinforces the unit's identity and its commitment to survival. And on the Eastern Front, where the German military was engaged in a conflict of a scale and duration that simply had no modern precedent, these kinds of shared rituals were not peripheral to the experience of combat. They were central to it. Let's talk about the Panzer crews themselves, because the men inside these machines are often reduced in historical memory to either heroic figures of wartime propaganda or faceless participants in a criminal enterprise. The truth is considerably more complex and considerably more human. The average German Panzer crewman who served on the Eastern Front was not a member of the ideologically committed SS. The Wehrmacht Panzer divisions were, by and large, professional soldiers. Men who had trained for their specific roles for months or years before Barbarossa. The driver had learned the mechanical language of tracked vehicles, how to feel through the controls whether the transmission was beginning to slip, how to nurse an overheating engine across terrain that was trying to destroy it. The gunner had learned to read ballistics through his sight, to compensate for range, wind, movement, to make a calculation that took fractions of a second and be right. The loader had trained to move ammunition in a cramped, moving, often tilting space without dropping it, without slowing the gunner's rate of fire, without letting the adrenaline of combat make him clumsy. The radio operator handled communications while also serving as the secondary gunner on the hull-mounted machine gun, managing two entirely different tasks simultaneously in conditions that made calm concentration almost impossible. And the commander, often the most experienced man in the tank, had to synthesize all of this, maintain situational awareness through limited vision, communicate with other vehicles and with higher command, make tactical decisions, and keep his crew alive. These were skilled specialists, and after months on the Eastern Front, they were also something else. They were deeply, profoundly changed by what they had experienced. The psychological literature on combat stress and trauma, which was barely embryonic during the Second World War itself, tells us things about what prolonged armored combat does to the human mind that would have been recognizable to any Eastern Front veteran, even if they didn't have the vocabulary for it. Hypervigilance, the inability to reduce threat scanning even when the immediate threat has passed, is one of the most consistent features of combat trauma. The nervous system, rewired by extended exposure to mortal danger, simply cannot return to its pre-combat baseline. Every sound becomes a potential threat. Every shadow, every change in the ambient noise of the environment, every unexpected movement triggers a cascade of physiological responses that evolution designed for actual survival situations, but that, in the context of prolonged modern warfare, never fully shut off. For a Panzer crew on the Eastern Front, this was not a malfunction. It was an adaptation. The men who survived longest were often the men whose hypervigilance was most consistently engaged, who woke up at sounds that their less experienced crewmates slept through, who noticed, before the attack came, that something about the ambient environment had changed, who were already moving, already oriented, already thinking tactically when the first shot was fired. The track ritual fed this. It was a way of encoding that vigilance into a shared practice that reinforced it across the entire crew, not just in the individual members who might naturally tend toward it. And here is where the story gets more complicated, because the ritual did not exist in isolation. It was part of a broader culture of adaptation that German panzer units developed on the Eastern Front, a culture that diverged significantly from official doctrine and, in some cases, from official orders, because official doctrine and official orders were increasingly disconnected from the reality that these crews were living in. The German High Command, for reasons that historians have argued about for 80 years, consistently underestimated the Soviet capacity for recovery and regeneration. When the Wehrmacht destroyed 10 Soviet divisions, the Soviets raised 12 more. When German logistics collapsed under the strain of the Russian winter of 1941 to 1942, the official response from Berlin was often denial, unrealistic demands for continued offensive operations, and the kind of map-based strategic thinking that bore no relationship to what was happening on the ground. The Panzer crews on the ground knew this. They knew it because they could see it. They could count the Soviet tanks emerging from the east in numbers that didn't match the reports of Soviet armored losses. They could feel the difference between the coordinated, improving Soviet attacks of 1942 and the disorganized formations of 1941. They could read the terrain and the weather in ways that their superiors in heated headquarters hundreds of kilometers to the west could not. And so they adapted. Not always in ways that were sanctioned, not always in ways that made it into official reports, but in ways that reflected the actual lessons of the actual war they were fighting. The maintenance culture in elite Panzer units became almost obsessive. Vehicles that broke down on the Eastern Front could not be easily recovered. A tank that threw a track in no man's land or in soft ground during the thaw season was, for practical purposes, lost. And a lost tank was not just a lost weapon system, it was a potential death sentence for its crew. So the crews learned to maintain their vehicles with a thoroughness that went beyond what the technical manuals required. They learned the specific failure modes of their engines under Russian winter conditions. They learned workarounds for parts that were unavailable because the supply chain had collapsed. They shared knowledge horizontally, crew to crew, sergeant to sergeant, in the informal networks that spring up in any military unit that is operating beyond the edge of its official support structure. The track ritual was part of this broader adaptive culture. It was informal knowledge, passed not through official channels, but through the same person-to-person networks that carried maintenance tips and tactical lessons. A veteran crew would demonstrate it to a new crew, not necessarily with a lengthy explanation, but with the simple authority of men who had survived in a place where most people did not. The implicit message was clear. This is something we do here. You should do it too. And new crews, who had arrived at the Eastern Front from training depots in Germany or France with doctrinal knowledge and no real experience, learned very quickly that the veterans' informal practices were worth more than almost anything they had been officially taught. Because the veterans were alive, and their experience was the most reliable guide available to that outcome. Let's talk about what the Eastern Front looked like from inside a tank in the specific moment that the ritual was designed to address. The moment after a battle, before rest. Because this is the moment that the ritual captures, and it is a moment that deserves to be understood in its full detail. A tank engagement in the latter stages of the Eastern Front, let's say somewhere in Ukraine in the summer of 1943, around the time of the Battle of Kursk, had a specific character. The scale of operations around Kursk was unprecedented even by Eastern Front standards. The Germans had assembled their largest concentration of armored forces, including their best equipped and most experienced Panzer divisions, along with the newest and most capable tanks they had yet produced, the Panther and the Tiger, which were appearing in significant numbers for the first time. The Soviets had known the attack was coming, had spent months preparing defensive lines of extraordinary depth and complexity, and had assembled a counterstrike force that dwarfed anything the Germans had faced in the West. The fighting in the Kursk salient, particularly around the southern flank near Prokhorovka, produced armored engagements of a density that crews described in terms that stretched the capacity of language to convey. Hundreds of tanks in a space of a few square kilometers, vehicles fighting at ranges so close that the sophisticated optics and fire control systems of the German tanks, designed for long-range kills against which the Soviets had no effective answer, became irrelevant. A T-34 that got inside 200 meters of a Tiger was almost as dangerous to it as it was to the T-34. After an engagement like this, if you were a German Panzer crew and you had survived, the immediate sensory experience was distinctive. The interior of the tank smelled of burned propellant, of hot metal, of the various human biological responses to extreme stress that nobody discusses in polite company. Your ears were ringing from the concussion of your own main gun firing and from nearby explosions. Your hands, if you were the driver or gunner, were trembling slightly from the sustained fine motor demands of combat. Your mouth was dry. Your vision, as the adrenaline began to metabolize, might be narrowing slightly at the edges. You were exhausted in a way that training exhaustion never produced, a deep cellular fatigue that went to the bones. And the commander, who had been managing the tactical situation through his cupola vision blocks and his intercom for the duration of the engagement, had to make the transition from combat decision-making to the decisions of the immediate aftermath: where to move the vehicle, how much ammunition remained, whether the engine and running gear were intact, whether any of his crew were wounded, what the situation was around him, where the other vehicles in his unit were, whether the threat had passed or merely paused. It is in this moment, this transition from the acute phase of combat to the fragile, false security of its immediate aftermath, that the track ritual occurred. And understanding the moment explains the ritual, because this is the moment when the temptation to let your guard down is strongest, when the body's own chemistry, the crashing aftermath of sustained adrenaline, is pushing you toward rest, toward relief, toward the belief that the worst is over. The ritual interrupted that process, deliberately. It forced the commander to make a decision, to give an order, and the crew to execute a specific task before any of them could allow themselves to move into the relative relaxation of the rest phase. It was a formal transition, a procedural gate between the combat state and the post-combat state, and crucially, the direction of that gate, the east, the enemy, kept the threat orientation alive even as the body was demanding that it be released. Modern military psychology has a term for this kind of practice. It is called a transition ritual, and it is now deliberately incorporated into some elite military training programs precisely because the research supports what the Eastern Front veterans discovered empirically. Controlled transitions between high arousal combat states and lower arousal recovery states, particularly transitions that include a specific orienting act toward the direction of threat, produce better decision-making in the immediate post-combat period and reduce the disorientation that can occur when the combat state collapses suddenly. The Eastern Front veterans, with no access to this research, had arrived at the same conclusion through the most rigorous possible experimental process: survival. Now let's address the question that hangs over all of this. Did it actually work? Did the track ritual save lives? And the honest answer is that this is almost impossible to measure with the kind of precision that a modern study would require. You cannot run a controlled trial on a tank battle. You cannot compare the survival rates of crews that performed the ritual with a matched group of crews that did not, controlling for all the other variables that determine survival on the Eastern Front. What you can do is look at the context. The units in which the ritual was most strongly maintained tended to be the same units with the most experienced leadership, the most rigorous maintenance culture, and the highest overall state of tactical readiness. Whether the ritual caused this or was simply correlated with it is a question that historical evidence cannot definitively answer. But there is another way to look at the question. Not did the ritual directly save lives through its mechanical effect, but did the attitude the ritual represented save lives? And here, the answer is considerably clearer. The single most consistent predictor of survival in armored combat on the Eastern Front, based on accounts from veterans of both sides, from German and Soviet after-action analyses, and from the broader historical record, was unit cohesion combined with sustained tactical awareness. Crews that maintained their discipline in the post-combat period, that treated rest as a conditional state rather than an absolute one, that stayed oriented toward the threat even when the immediate crisis had passed, survived at significantly higher rates than crews that did not. Not because combat doesn't kill disciplined, vigilant soldiers. It absolutely does. But because over the extended duration of the Eastern Front campaign, the cumulative advantage of consistent vigilance was measurable. And the ritual was a technology for maintaining that vigilance. A simple, memorable, repeatable practice that encoded a complex psychological state into a physical act that anyone in the crew could observe and verify. There is also the question of what the ritual communicated within the crew. Because a tank crew is a very small unit, 5 men in a space that forced a degree of physical proximity and mutual dependence that few military relationships outside of submarines or special operations teams could match. The dynamics of that unit, the trust, the communication, the shared understanding of roles and expectations were critical to performance. A crew that was divided, where the commander didn't trust the driver's judgment or the gunner resented the commander's decisions, was a crew that was more likely to die in a moment of crisis that required seamless, instant coordination. The ritual contributed to unit cohesion in a specific way. By making the orientation toward the east a shared practice rather than an individual habit, it created a visible expression of shared values and shared commitment. When every member of the crew participated in the rotation, they were all affirming the same thing: that they were a unit that did not drop its guard, that they were a unit that remembered where the danger lay, that they were a unit that was going to survive this war if human discipline and human skill had any say in the matter. In an environment where so much was outside the crew's control, where the decisions that determined their immediate fate were often made by generals hundreds of kilometers away, who had no accurate picture of what was happening, the ritual was an act of agency. It was the crew asserting, in the only domain they fully controlled, their own standards and their own commitment to each other. This is not a small thing. In the psychology of extreme environments, the capacity to perform deliberate, meaningful acts within a context of overwhelming constraint is one of the most powerful predictors of sustained performance. Viktor Frankl, writing about a very different kind of extreme environment, made the same observation. The last human freedom is the freedom to choose one's attitude toward any given set of conditions. The track ritual was a material expression of exactly that freedom. Let's widen the lens now, because the Eastern Front track ritual did not exist in isolation from the broader history of armored warfare, and understanding its place in that history illuminates something important about how military knowledge actually develops and transmits itself in wartime. The development of armored doctrine in the 20th century followed a pattern that was consistent across almost all major military powers. Official doctrine lagged behind practice. The men in the field, responding to the immediate demands of real combat against real opponents in real terrain and weather, developed solutions that official doctrine had not anticipated. Some of those solutions eventually made it back into official doctrine, often only after significant losses had demonstrated that the official approach was inadequate. Others remained in the informal knowledge networks of experienced soldiers and were lost when those soldiers were killed or when the war ended and the units dissolved. In German armored doctrine specifically, there had been a strong culture of Auftragstaktik, or mission-type tactics, which gave commanders at the lowest levels significant latitude to make decisions appropriate to their immediate situation rather than waiting for orders from above. This culture had produced the tactical flexibility that made German armored operations so effective in the early war period. But it also meant that a great deal of the most valuable tactical knowledge was never formally captured. It lived in the people, not in the documents. The track ritual was a product of this culture. It emerged from the field, from the crews who were living the war, not from the training schools or the doctrine writers in Berlin. It was transmitted through the same informal networks that transmitted other forms of field-developed knowledge. And it was valuable precisely because it was informal, because it came with the authority of survival rather than the authority of rank. This pattern of field-developed practices spreading through informal networks and being underappreciated or invisible to official observers is not unique to German armor on the Eastern Front. It appears in almost every prolonged combat experience in military history. American soldiers in Vietnam developed their own informal rituals and practices around the specific threat environment they faced. British soldiers in the Western Desert in North Africa developed maintenance and tactical practices that went beyond official doctrine in response to the specific demands of that theater. The Israeli Defense Forces, drawing on their consistent experience of existential conflict, have developed a culture of informal knowledge transfer that is now recognized as one of their most significant military assets. What the German Panzer crews on the Eastern Front were doing was what experienced soldiers in demanding environments have always done. They were learning from the war they were actually fighting, faster than the official system could capture and codify that learning, and they were transmitting what they learned through the channels that were available to them. The track ritual was one data point in a much larger body of informal knowledge, but it was a particularly visible and memorable one, which is why it survived in the accounts of veterans and why it has resonated with subsequent generations trying to understand what the Eastern Front actually felt like from the inside. Let's talk about the tank types, because the machines matter to this story in ways that are easy to overlook. The ritual developed across multiple generations of German armored equipment, and the specific characteristics of each tank shaped the experience of the crews who served in them in ways that affected everything, including the informal practices they developed. The Panzer III was the primary German medium tank at the start of Barbarossa. It was a well-designed vehicle by the standards of 1941, reliable, mechanically sound, and equipped with good optics that gave it an advantage over most of its early opponents. But it was undergunned against the T-34 and the KV-1, which appeared in numbers and with capabilities that the German military had not fully anticipated. So, the Panzer III crews on the Eastern Front in the summer and autumn of 1941 were often in the position of facing opponents they could not reliably kill from ranges that their own vehicles could be killed from. This produced a specific kind of anxiety that is visible in the accounts of veterans from this period, the anxiety of being outclassed by an enemy you had been assured was inferior. The Panzer IV, which had existed alongside the Panzer III from the start, but in a different role, became increasingly important as the war progressed, and was progressively upgunned with longer-barreled weapons that could compete with Soviet armor at longer ranges. By 1943, the long-barreled Panzer IV was the backbone of German armored strength on the Eastern Front, and it was in the Panzer IV units that many of the most experienced Eastern Front crews served. Then came the Panther and the Tiger. The Tiger I, which entered service in late 1942, was in many respects the most capable tank on the Eastern Front in terms of firepower and frontal armor protection. Its 88mm gun could destroy any Soviet tank at ranges that exceeded the Soviets' ability to effectively return fire, and its frontal armor was effectively immune to most Soviet anti-tank weapons at combat ranges. But it was mechanically complex, prone to breakdown, and expensive to produce and maintain. The Tigers were always scarce. They fought in small numbers, often attached to Panzer divisions as heavy companies, and the crews who served in them were typically among the most experienced available. The culture of meticulous maintenance that Tiger crews developed was legendary within the German armored force and represented an extreme version of the broader adaptive culture that the Eastern Front had produced. The Panther was more complex still. Fast, well-armored on the glacis, with a gun that was effective against all Soviet armor, it suffered from mechanical reliability problems that were severe in its early deployment and remained a factor throughout the war. Panther crews on the Eastern Front learned very quickly that the mechanical health of their vehicle was an existential issue in a way that their training had not fully prepared them for. Across all of these vehicles, the ritual persisted. It was not tied to a specific tank type. It was tied to the Eastern Front itself, to the specific threat environment that the East represented, regardless of what you were driving. And this is telling, because it suggests that the ritual was not a response to any mechanical characteristic of the vehicles. It was a response to the operational environment and to the psychological demands that environment placed on crews regardless of their equipment. Now, let's look at specific moments in the Eastern Front campaign where the attitude that the ritual represented was most visibly the difference between survival and death. Because the abstract argument for the ritual's value becomes much more concrete when you look at the specific tactical situations that made it necessary. The winter of 1941 to 1942 was the first great shock. The German advance on Moscow had stalled. The Wehrmacht, which had been planned and equipped for a short campaign, found itself facing a Russian winter with inadequate winter clothing, lubricants that froze in their tracks and engines, and an enemy that had not only adapted to the winter, but was using it as an operational weapon. Soviet forces launched counterattacks in conditions that German units were simply not prepared to fight in. Tanks that were not properly maintained, whose tracks were not adjusted for the cold, whose engines had not been properly winterized, broke down at catastrophic rates. The units that survived the winter of 1941 to 1942 in relatively better condition were, with few exceptions, the units that had already developed the culture of obsessive maintenance and sustained vigilance that the track ritual represented. Because that culture meant that the winterization tasks, the procedures for keeping vehicles operational in extreme cold, were being performed as a matter of course, rather than as emergency measures implemented after the problem became critical. The counterattacks during this winter also introduced German armored crews to a threat that would define their experience for the next 3.5 years. The threat of being overrun at rest. Soviet infantry and armor, exploiting the German tendency to consolidate defensively overnight, repeatedly attacked German positions in the darkness and in weather conditions that degraded visibility and response time. Units that maintained full defensive readiness through the night, that kept their vehicles oriented toward the expected threat axes, that had crews who could respond instantly to an attack warning, consistently performed better in these situations than units that had allowed their guard to drop. The track ritual, or practices equivalent to it, appears in accounts from this period specifically in the context of units that had learned this lesson, that in the East, the difference between a resting vehicle and a combat-ready vehicle had to be minimized to the greatest possible extent. Stalingrad introduced a different dimension, urban combat, which armored doctrine had always treated as an environment to avoid if possible, became unavoidable in the fight for the city. Tanks in urban environments faced threats from almost every direction, but in the Stalingrad fighting specifically, the East was where the Soviet-held buildings were, where the snipers and the tank hunters with their improvised weapons and their desperate, lethal creativity were waiting. German crews operating in Stalingrad developed what can only be described as a constant rotational awareness, a habit of keeping their most protected face, their frontal armor, toward whatever direction the most acute threat lay in, and shifting that orientation as the situation changed. This was the track ritual in its most dynamic form, not a single static gesture performed at the end of a day's fighting, but a continuous, active practice of threat orientation that never fully switched off. Veterans who survived Stalingrad and went on to fight in the later years of the Eastern Front brought this heightened version of the practice with them, and it influenced the units they joined. The Kursk Battle of July 1943 is often cited as the turning point of the armored war on the Eastern Front, and from a purely material standpoint, that analysis is broadly correct. The German offensive failed, the Soviet counterstrike succeeded, and the strategic initiative passed permanently to the Soviet side. But for the individual Panzer crews who survived Kursk, the most significant thing about that battle was what it demonstrated about the cost of even momentary lapses in vigilance. The fighting around Prokhorovka on the 12th of July, 1943, produced the loss of significant German armored strength in a very short time period. After-action analyses identified several contributing factors, but one that recurs in veteran accounts is the problem of orientation. In the dense, close-range fighting that developed around Prokhorovka, vehicles that were not immediately oriented toward the most acute threat axis at the moment a crisis developed were more likely to be engaged from an aspect other than their most heavily armored one. The seconds required to pivot a tank toward a threat that had appeared from an unexpected direction were sometimes seconds that did not exist. The crews that survived Prokhorovka and other engagements of similar intensity at Kursk often described, in the years after the war, a kind of constant pre-orientation that had become instinctive, not just at rest, but in any moment of relative pause during combat. The track ritual was the formalized expression of this instinct applied to the specific vulnerability of the post-combat rest period. After Kursk, the nature of the German armored war on the Eastern Front changed fundamentally. The Wehrmacht was no longer capable of major offensive operations of the kind that had defined the first 2 years of the campaign. What followed was a fighting withdrawal that lasted 2 more years, covering thousands of kilometers of contested ground, and it produced a specific kind of tactical experience that was unlike anything that came before or after. In a fighting withdrawal, the relationship with the East is even more psychologically complex than it is in an offensive or a static defensive. You are moving away from the East, retreating toward the West, but the threat is following you from the East. The East is always behind you, always closer than you want it to be, always producing the threat that is driving your movement. This created a psychological state in Panzer crews during the withdrawal phase that veterans described as a constant awareness of a pressure at your back. Not paranoia, not panic, but a sustained alertness that never fully resolved because the threat never fully resolved. The East never stopped being dangerous. It only changed its specific form. In this context, the track ritual took on an additional meaning. Facing east was not just orienting toward a potential threat, it was an acknowledgement of what was driving the war's dynamics at that point. It was a refusal to turn your back on the reality of the situation, and in a military culture that was being subjected to an enormous amount of official pressure to deny that reality, to frame the retreats as planned strategic withdrawals and the losses as manageable setbacks, the act of facing east was almost a form of honesty. The men who rotated that track knew what was happening. They knew the war was going badly. They knew the initiative had passed to the Soviets. They knew that the East was not a direction from which they would eventually return in triumph. And by continuing to face it, by continuing to orient toward it, with the same discipline they had maintained when things were different, they were acknowledging the truth that their leadership was not acknowledging. This is perhaps the most profound dimension of the ritual, the one that is hardest to see if you focus only on its practical military utility. The track ritual was also a form of honest reckoning in an army that was increasingly asked to believe in miracles, in wonder weapons, in the possibility of a strategic reversal that the material situation made impossible. The Eastern Front crews who kept facing east were the men who were doing their actual jobs with whatever resources they had, without illusions about the larger situation. Discipline without illusions, vigilance without hope, performance without the comfort of believing it would change the ultimate outcome. This is what the ritual represented in its final form, as the German army retreated across the same ground it had taken in 1941 and 1942, back through Ukraine, through Poland, back toward the German border itself. There is something important to understand about how the ritual was transmitted across the years of the war, because it did not maintain itself automatically. Every Panzer crew was finite. Men were killed, wounded, taken prisoner, transferred, invalided out. The remarkable experience of an elite crew that had been fighting since 1941 was constantly being diluted by the addition of replacements who arrived from training with no experience of the Eastern Front's specific demands. And yet the ritual persisted. It persisted because the units that maintained it were also the units that made a conscious effort to transmit their informal knowledge to new arrivals, because the experienced commanders and NCOs, who were the carriers of this knowledge, treated its transmission as a priority, not an optional extra. A new crewman arriving at an Eastern Front Panzer unit in 1943 or 1944 entered an environment that was aggressively educating him in the difference between what he had learned in training and what the Eastern Front actually required. The veterans who were still alive were alive in part because they had learned these lessons and had not forgotten them. And they were highly motivated to pass them on, because a new crewman who got killed because he hadn't learned the right lessons was not just a tragedy in human terms, he was a gap in the unit's capability, at a time when every crew member's competence was a survival issue for everyone else in the tank. The track ritual was one of the easiest elements of this informal education to demonstrate and to remember. It was simple, it was specific, it was visual, and it came with the weight of every survival story that the veterans who demonstrated it could tell. When an experienced commander showed a new crewman the track rotation and said, in effect, "This is what we do here," the authority of that instruction was the authority of a man who had been doing this for 2 years and was still breathing. That authority was difficult to argue with, and the new crewmen didn't argue with it. They adopted it. Because on the Eastern Front, the cost of dismissing a veteran's informal knowledge as superstition was potentially your life, and the men who arrived as replacements had usually seen enough by the time they reached